Welcome back everyone to the React In-Depth series. In this video, what we're going to do is go over the useEffect hook. In the previous video, we saw some exercises on the useState hook, as well as before that, the theory on the useState hook. It was our first kind of adventure into hooks in React. This is the next most important hook that we need to learn in order to understand really how to build proper applications with React in modern applications. The useEffect hook is a little bit quirky and something that kind of strikes a lot of, I guess, fear and terror. I know when I first learned React a while back, this hook was just really confusing. And to be completely honest, it still is kind of confusing. There's a lot of nuances to this hook and things that can go wrong. There's so many different ways to use it, and when and why and where to use it. All those things are not always immediately clear. So I made this video. Hopefully it might be a bit long, so I apologize in advance for that. We'll see. But I really want to make sure that we have a fundamental understanding of what this hook actually does for us and how we can use it and where it might actually bite us if we use it incorrectly. So enough of me yapping. Let's actually get to the contents to see what I'm talking about. Okay, so to start, I just kind of want to define this useEffect hook, and then we'll actually see some code and a bunch of examples shortly with some nice visuals, hopefully, to clear it up. So the useEffect hook in React was introduced with kind of this hooks style of coding with React, the functional style of programming. Previously, there was a class-based version of React that everything was based on classes and object-oriented programming concepts. And this is kind of a corollary to a lot of those concepts. And it makes them a bit easier, but also a little bit more complicated if you're not careful. So the point of a useEffect hook is kind of in the actual name. And that is this first point right here that I have on the slide, which is to run a side effect in a component. Now, that doesn't really make much sense if you don't really know what a side effect is or an effect is in general. So this idea actually comes from functional programming, which React hooks and modern functional React is actually based on. And a side effect is kind of this idea that you have something on the side that you don't really have much control over, that is kind of outside of the main system that you're dealing with, and could kind of cause different types of behavior, and is not like the pure functional programming sense of things. So it's usually a way to store state or deal with state or deal with systems that is slightly less functional or pure functional in its original sense. Now that's a bit confusing, so we'll definitely go through kind of a bit more of that concept as we go through this video, and hopefully it makes a bit more sense. But that's really where the name actually comes from. And as I kind of hinted at, the main point of a useEffect hook is to talk or sync with or interact with some kind of external system. Now, the word system here is purposely vague. The system could be the DOM, it could be a database, it could be an API, it could be some server somewhere for some other purpose, but any kind of system outside of React is really what this is talking about. This is talking about anything that is outside of the scope of what React knows and understands and is controlling. And at its core, also what we're going to see throughout this video is that it was really a nice way to hook into the component lifecycle. And I'll show that slide again just so we know what I'm talking about. But those are the things like the mounting of a component, the updating of a component, and the unmounting of a component, and kind of everything in between there. Now, the React hooks is really a quirk of the architecture that React uses in its modern functional style. Personally, I'm kind of on the fence about it. I don't really like it that much. We have to use it because that's really just the way in the escape hatch we need to use in the context of React to deal with systems. There are other frameworks that don't really have this concept of like a useEffect, but they do deal with side effects in a different way, arguably a simpler way than kind of all the quirks that we have to deal with in React. React is definitely getting a bit older now, This is kind of a carryover from the idea of the class-based components and how we had to do the same thing in functional components. So just keep that in mind. This is usually a little bit more unique to React, but the concepts and the overarching ideas of needing to sync with an external system and this idea of side effects is consistent across frameworks and even across languages, but the way that they're dealt with is different, and the way that React deals with it is called useEffect. Now, I just want to give some examples just so that we're not like speaking too vaguely when we talk about useEffect. Now, what can we use this useEffect for in React? Now, I'm just listing a few here, but things like data fetching. We're going to talk to an API, want to get some JSON, or we're some other kind of API that's not a REST API, for example. We're gonna do that usually through some kind of useEffect hook or something that uses useEffect internally if it's like a library, for example. If we want to set up event listeners on like the window or the page or something beyond just something that we do in the JSX like we normally do, that is somewhere to do it with the useEffect hook. Intersection observers, if you've seen that before, it's a web API to deal with like how far you scroll up and down a page, for example, and some other different things. And like when you see a component like show up on a page, you can set those up in a useEffect because setting them up outside of useEffect might cause a bunch of issues. Observables and subscriptions, this is a pretty popular topic in modern JavaScript. These are another example of things that you can set up in a useEffect. Now, this is just a small set. There's a whole bunch of things you can do in a useEffect. But this is usually what you'll end up doing, and I'll probably create a video at some point dealing with specifically data fetching, because that's quite a doozy if you're trying to do it from scratch without a library, but it's important to know nonetheless, and it will use useEffect behind the scenes. All right, so the component lifecycle. I want to start with this because this is really the mental model we need to understand the useEffect hook for the most part. Now, it kind of goes beyond this idea, but having this at the back of your mind really helps figure out like, when is this code running? Why is it rerunning or running again or not running? And it also helps you figure out a lot of bugs related to kind of those ideas. So remember that in React, a component kind of goes through this life cycle, right? We kind of initialize it. But mainly these three stages here, where we mount the component into the DOM, that's where it actually shows up with all its states and all that kind of stuff for the first time. Then when we update things like state and other stuff, we re-render that component, and it gets kind of stuck in this update loop until it finally gets unmounted from the DOM when we don't really need it anymore. And that might be like moving to a different page, for example, using like a routing like concept, like we would go from home page to the blog page or something, and then we don't need the home page anymore, so we unmount that component, for example. So keep this in the back of your mind. It'll really help a lot as we go through these ideas. Now, we saw with the use state hook when we first learned about hooks that it is this real idea right here that we can actually hook into, right? That's where the name comes from, these lifecycle stages, right? So we can hook into the mounting stage or the updating stage or the unmounting stage with the useEffect hook. Now remember, the use state hook really allowed us to hook into kind of what shows in the DOM and how it gets updated and shown as the actual markup inside the DOM. But useEffect is going to allow us to actually work with all of these different stages of the lifecycle in various ways. And if you use the class syntax for React before, they had their own specific kind of nomenclature for these kinds of things. I believe it was like a component did mount or did unmount or will update and all that kind of stuff. So this is the same kind of idea, but with React hooks. That was a long time ago, so I don't really use the class syntax for React these days. It's usually only for legacy systems. So hopefully, if you've used that before, that should make that transition a bit easier as well. Okay, so this syntax, and I promise we'll get to the code shortly before I go too down the theory rabbit hole, but it's important to kind of have this at the back of our mind. So this is the syntax for the useEffect hook. We'll write this out together, so don't worry too much about it. The most important thing is that it, just like useState, we have to import it. I guess I forgot to do that in this slide, but we got to import it. It's actually a function that is part of the React library. Once we import it, we can use it. And the signature looks like this. Okay, we really have two parameters for this function and arguments that we can pass it. The first is a function, right? And the second is what's called a dependency array. And this is optional. All right. Now I'm going to focus on this first part to start, and then we'll kind of move down to the dependency array and why we need it shortly. Now, for example, if we were to use it with just the function, it would look like this, right? We are calling useEffect, and we are passing it as the first argument a function. Now, this could be a predefined function somewhere else, or we could do it in line, just like this, where I'm passing an arrow function within the actual the parameter list for this function. Now, usually you'll see it done this way. But a lot of time, if you have a lot of code, you might see it referencing a function somewhere else that's pre-written. It doesn't really matter as long as you pass it a function. Okay. We don't want to run that function. We want to pass it the function signature so that useEffect will run it later when it needs to, depending on a few different rules. Okay. Now I'm going to go through a few ways that we can use this, and then I'll pull up the code editor and we'll actually go through some examples to see kind of how this works. So the first way I want to show you is this. Now, if we code useEffect with no dependency array, we are hooking into really this stage right here, which is the update stage. So again, this is a signature. The way to really probably think about this is kind of what I have outlined here is the function is telling useEffect what to do, right? And the dependency array is telling useEffect when to do it. Right? I found that very helpful as kind of a mental model to understand this hook, because if you think about it in that context, it makes it much easier to understand what's going on. So in this case, we actually are not telling it when to do it, if you think about it, because we're not passing in the dependency array, right? So if we do it this way, that's kind of implicitly telling React and useEffect, hey, just do this all the time. Okay, like I don't have any dependencies, just kind of do this thing, this effect, just all the time. And what does all the time mean in the context of React? Well, that means every single re-render, including the first re-render, which we call mount. So let me pull up my code editor here, and I'll kind of code this out, and we can see some other examples as we build this out, just so we have a good mental model of how this actually works before going too far with the theory. Okay. So I'm going to pull up my terminal here, and I'll create a new React project. I'll do npm create vite at latest, and I'll run that. And I'll just call this useEffect, just like that. I'll make sure I use React. I'll make sure I use JavaScript. It's going to give me the instructions to change into that folder. I'm going to run npm install, and while it does that, I'm going to open up these files here. I know you're probably getting tired of me doing these steps all the time, but it really is important, especially for those of you that haven't seen the Vite setup before. It's there for you, but it's also important to get this repetition going just so that you're comfortable creating many different React projects and just kind of playing around with them and not really like forgetting. That muscle memory really helps a lot. I'm just gonna get rid of this index CSS, and I'll save that. And instead of using the app here, I'm going to create a new file in my source folder. Actually, you know what? I'll just use the app. I'll just use the app. Why not? And I'll just get rid of pretty much everything in here. And I'll get rid of everything here. And I'll get rid of everything in here. And my app will look like that. And I'll just return an H1 for now. And I'll just say app, just like that. Okay, and that install is done. And I'll run npm run dev to run the dev script so that it starts the server. I think I have to copy this because actually I think my Chrome is acting a little bit weird. So let's see if this works. So I switch back here, open a new tab and do that. And there we go. All right, so I have my app and I'll open my inspector here. And there it is. Let me just zoom in on that as well. And we can see that there is my H1 showing up in my app, and then my console is there as well. Okay, perfect. So that's all working. Now, we're not looking at use states. I'll leave that in there for a second, but I'll also import useEffect. Okay, and this is how you'd import it from the React library. Now, I want to show you something. The way that we use this, again, as we saw, is we call this function just like this, and we can pass it optionally. Let me close this off here on the side just so that we're not distracted by that. We can pass it optionally a second parameter, but we have to pass it at least the first parameter. So I'm going to or argument in this case. I'm going to pass it a arrow function. Okay. And in this arrow function, I'm going to do a console.log, and I'll just say hi there, just like that. Okay. Now, I didn't pass it a second argument. So based on what I just said, this is going to run every single render, including the first render, which we call the mount. So let's see if that's true. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to go to my console. You can see it ran twice. I'm going to refresh the page, which means it's going to mount this component, and I'm going to see how many times it gets logged out. And it gets logged out twice. Okay, so that's a bit curious. So what is going on here? Why is it doing it twice? Well, this has to do with how React works in dev mode. It's actually going to run our component 2 times to actually test this exact functionality where our effects can get cleaned up properly, which we'll see later on, and a couple of other things so that it can do some kind of behind the scenes work to make sure that our components are pure and some other things. So we actually should only see this once. If we would run this in production, this should only really show up one time. Now that's fine. And this is called the mounting stage. So really, we're not actually using the fact that this is running more than one time. Okay. Now I'm going to switch back to my slides here. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. If I show you this slide, which is the next one I want to show you, the only difference between this one and the one I just showed you, you see it? You see it? All right, there it is I added the dependency array, but it's empty. There's nothing in there. It's just an empty array. So what does this mean? Well, recall again, our wording is this is when to do this thing. This is telling React if it's empty and only if it's empty, run this function, this code, only on mount. And that means when it first gets inserted and then rendered into the DOM. So let's test this out, because if this is true, that means that right now, if I was to add this dependency array, there would actually be no functional difference in the code that or in our logging, because our component is simply mounting, which is actually the same thing as an update. So let's see if that's true. So I'm going to add a empty array here, and I'm going to save that, and I'll switch back to Chrome. I'll reload the page, and we get, 2 again because it's in dev mode, but we get the same behavior. Okay, so if there's no re-rendering happening and we're just mounting the component, that's kind of the same thing as like the first update, for example. Okay, now that might be a bit confusing, and I appreciate that, which is why I'm going to kind of go back to this one and show you what the real difference is between these two, because it's a real critical piece that we need to kind of unlock. So what really was the difference there? Well, let me show you something. I'm actually going to use state here. I'm going to say const, and I'll just say, let's do text, set text equal to use state. Actually, you know what? I'll do counter. I'll do counter and set counter. Always switch last minute. And I'll start at 0. And what I'll do is here, we'll just go the traditional paragraph tag. And in here, I'll say counter. And right below that, I'll create a button, and I'll say go up. And on click, I'm just going to do this inline just so you can see this differently, so I don't have to create a separate function. I'm going to create an arrow function. Again, we can't call set counter directly in here because that's going to call it as soon as this renders. We want to pass a callback to the code that we want to run. I'm going to set counter to count +1. Okay, so this is saying I could have done this up here and defined it, but this is a kind of alternative way. I actually don't like writing code inside of my JSX like this, but I just want to show you that it is possible. And for now, I'll just do that. Great. So let's see what happens. So what this is doing is we have some state showing in our markup. And every time I click this button, it's going to change. Oops, this is counter. You probably saw that. Hoping I changed that. Counter. It's going to change counter, which is going to cause our app to re-render, and that new version of counter to show up here, which is going to go to 1 to 2 to 3, etc., etc. So the question really is, how many times are we going to see this useEffect run? Well, if what I just showed you is correct about the fact that this is only going to run when we mount our component, then what we're going to see is this only run one time. right? Because the component only mounts one time. Everything else in that component lifecycle is considered a update. So let's see if that's true. I'm going to switch back to Chrome here. I'm going to reload the page. We're going to see hi there, right? And again, 2 times because we're running in dev mode. But now, most critically, I want to make sure that when I click this go up button, that this does change, right? But we don't see hi there logged out. So let's test it. Ready? 1, 2, 3. There we go. All right, so you can see I'm clicking this, right? And we're no longer seeing any hi there logged out. And the reason is that this only runs when we mount the component. And the way to think about it is if I come back here, you can see that right here, all these 3 things, if I can highlight all of them at once, I can't control command click on here, but if I was to kind of select all these 3 components, this is the app component. It's going to get inserted into the DOM. When I'm clicking go up, the only thing that's changing is that p tag. We saw that from how the useState hooks works, right? And React is smart enough to only change that part of the component without actually having to remount the entire component. It's not recreating necessarily the H1 or the button. It's only changing this p tag. So that's why it's considered an update and not a full mounting of that entire component. But when we reload the page, it does have to create that entire component for the first time, including the H1, the P, and the button, and puts it all into the DOM, which is considered a mount. Okay, now I want to show you the difference here. I'm just going to do one small thing. I'm going to remove this dependency array so that now we have it as just only one argument to our useEffect. I'm going to save that. And what we're going to see is that now this is not only going to run on mount, which is the first render, but it's also going to run on every single re-render of our app component. And when does it re-render? Well, it re-renders whenever a counter changes in this case, which is every time we click the button, we should actually see this hi there being logged out. So let's switch back to our app here. I'll go to console and I'll reload the page. So we see a hi there. So that's still working as expected. That's the mounting one. Now, what we should see is now when I click go up, it should actually log out this time. So there we go. Hi there, hi there, hi there, hi there, hi there. Okay, see, now it's only showing one time because that's how this function is actually set up to work. So it's set up to run every single re-render of our component, which is happening when we change this state. And it doesn't matter which state, right? If we had multiple states in this component, it doesn't matter which state is changing in this case. If anything changes and the component needs to be re-rendered, we are going to see this logged out if we don't have a dependency array. All right, so you're probably thinking, well, okay, that kind of makes sense. I can run some code when the component first is in the DOM. And that's pretty useful, right? So that might be useful for like fetching something, for example, or running some startup stuff or setting up some intersection observer or event listeners or whatever. That might be pretty useful only that one time. We don't want to set it up multiple times. And then every re-render one, maybe that's useful. That is very similar actually to kind of putting it out here, if you think about it, right? If I put hi there from outside and I save this and I rerun this, what we'll see is it's very similar to how this will the useEffect works, right? We're going to see it from both every single time, and this is happening from I think one of my extensions. So please ignore that. But the main difference, and I'll show you this later when we look at the memory structure, how this works, is that this runs synchronously and this actually runs asynchronously. Okay, so generally speaking, you don't want to have too much code out here in your component that's doing a bunch of stuff. You want to kind of leverage the hooks, but there are some exceptions to that. And we'll see some of those as we get more used to different types of hooks in React. So I'm going to save this with our useEffect. And again, this is going to run on every single re-render. Now, I want to show you that there's one more way to think about this. And you probably caught it, right? I showed you so far, there's a way to run stuff when the component mounts. There's a way to run stuff when we have every single re-render. And ignoring the unmounting for a second, there is actually one more thing that we actually need as a tool. And that is this one right here. Okay? We need a way to also run code effects when some particular state changes. Only then. but never any other time. Okay. Now, the way that we do this is by putting those variables inside of the dependency array. And this tells React, please only run this code, this orange code right here, the function that we pass in, the effect function, when the state value changes that I'm passing to this dependency array. All right, so let me show you how that works. If I come back to VS Code here, the state that we have right here is counter. So the way that we make this work is I'll put a dependency array here, and I'm going to literally tell React, watch this variable right here, counter. And every time counter changes, I want you to run this code. Hi there. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to Chrome. I'll reload this app. And we see that we get hi there the first time, and that's because counter is changing the very, very first time when we mount the component. We are setting it to its very first value, which is 0, which technically counts as like a change. This is very similar to the onMount behavior for this specific variable. Okay, so it's always at least going to run that one time. Now, this behavior though is that if we click go up, we're going to see hi there logged out. And it's going to be logged out every single time counter changes. So you're probably thinking, well, how is this any different than what we just saw over here, which is run it on every single update? Well, if we had another state, that would change things. So let me show you what I mean. I'll call this const. I'll say, I'll just go, I can't do naming on the fly here. I'll just say counter2, set counter2. And this is going to be useState. And you know what, for fun, I'll start at 10. Why not? And I will put a p tag here, and I'll say counter2. And just so it's a bit more clear, I'll say this is counter, and that this is counter2. All right, and I'll create another button here. I'll just duplicate this line so that we have 2 of these buttons. And this is go up for counter1, and this is go up for, I'll just abbreviate this for counter2, just so I don't have to spend too much time there. And then this is set counter 2 to counter 2 plus 1. Okay, so that's the main difference here is I'm changing one more button to create a manipulation to this state, and this button here is for changing this state right here. Okay, and those are states set up right here. Now I'm going to leave this effect here. And I'll change this around just so we really understand what's happening shortly. But I only have an effect listening to counter like 1 in this case, the first counter right here, which will only change if I change this button right here. All right, so let's see if that works. I'm going to refresh this page, and we see hi there being logged out. Now I'm going to click on go up counter 2, and notice that counter 2 is going up, but we're not getting any logs here, right? So the app is re-rendering, right? This whole function is re-rendering because we're getting this new counter 2 here, but we're not seeing this logged again. This is only going to log in this case when counter changes. So let's test that. I'm gonna click go up C1 here, and there we go. We get our hi there, right? And that is showing definitively that even if we change this state here, this particular useEffect is set up to only change when this changes over here. Now let's start combining these. For example, what we can do is we can have multiple things in here. I can say, well, when either of the counters change, I want you to run this code. And as you can imagine, if I reload this page, this is going to work for either of these counters. I could even split these up separately. So for example, I could take this and I could duplicate it, and I could say this is hi there from counter 1, I guess. And then this is hi there from counter 2. And I can do that, right? Now I have a separate effect. Depending on which counter is changing, I'm going to run that effect depending on that state change. So if I reload this page, we will see both of those logged out the first time, again, duplicated because of the dev mode. But now if I click on C2, we see that hi there from counter 2. If I click C1, I see hi there from counter 1. Okay, and now we can have fine-grained control over running particular code depending on particular states being changed, which is pretty awesome. Now, I want to contrast this to what happens if I run it on every single re-render. I'll put another useEffect on here, and I'll say console.log, and I'll just put re-rendered, just like that. I can't really spell re-rendered. There you go. And this is going to have no dependency array. Okay, which means that this is going to run every single re-render. I want you to think for a second, without even looking at kind of if you're coding along, like without even going back and looking at the actual browser's effect, what is going to happen in this case when we click on counter 1 versus counter 2, and what should we see the very first time the component actually mounts? All right, you ready? Let's take a look. So I'm going to reload the page. So we're going to get hi there from counter 1, hi there from counter 2, and we're going to get our re-rendered. Okay, and we're going to get that 2 times because of just the dev mode that I mentioned. Now, that happens on mount because those all change the very first time, and that's how the hook is set up to run at least one time. Now, I'm going to click the counter 1 to go up. I'm going to expect to see hi there from counter 1, but I'm also going to expect to see re-rendered because the app just re-rendered, and it's regardless of what change, we want that to actually console log. So let's see if that's true. I'll just highlight this here just so you can see where I last left off, and I click go up C1, and you can see we indeed see those two things. We see hi there counter 1, and then we see re-rendered, right? So those are the things that we saw from counter 1 changing, which makes sense because the app re-renders in order to re-render counter 1, but counter 2's useEffect did not run, and vice versa. If I click go up for C2, we'll see that hi there from counter 2, but also the re-rendered being run, which makes sense because that's just kind of the two effects that we set up. It's going to re-render the component, and in this case, only counter 2 is being changed. Therefore, the effect for that is being set up to watch that state. Cool. Now, let's set up one more thing on here. I'm going to put another useEffect. And in here, I'm going to put a console log, and I'll say mounted. Okay, there we go. So now we have 4 effects. Okay, we have one for when counter 1 is changing, one for when counter 2 is changing, one for every single re-render, no matter what has been changed. And oh, I forgot to put my dependency array here. Probably caught that. There we go. And we have one here for only when the component is first mounted into the DOM, and I'll save that. All right, so let's see the effect here. I'm going to reload the page. So we're going to see hi there counter 1, hi there counter 2, re-rendered, but also are mounted, right? And 2 times again because of the dev mode. Now, when I click go up for counter 1, recall that mounted only happens one time, right? We're not unmounting this entire component from the DOM and remounting it. We're just kind of precisely changing that part of the component during a re-render. So if I click for go up for C1, what we'll see is same behavior as before, where we have counter 1 and re-rendered. If I click go up C2, we'll see same behavior as before, hi there counter 2, and then re-rendered. We will not see the mounted ever being run again because the component is only mounted one time. Now, why is that useful for us? Well, that controls that we have a control in place so that when that first is visible in the DOM, we can do something with it. So for example, if we show and hide a component, we can unmount and remount it a bunch of times. Or for first visiting a component by going through, for example, different web pages and from homepage to blog page to about page, then we are mounting those components and unmounting them and remounting them, right? So that's where that becomes useful. But from changing a page in place the way that we're doing right now, those are just re-renders, and we have control over it using these different methods that we just looked at. So really, this is most of what you need to understand useEffect quite deeply. The next part we're going to go through is also very important, but at its core, this is what really useEffect allows us to do. It allows us to hook into the lifecycle of the component and run some kind of side effect, like in this case, console logging. Now imagine that this console log, or in this case, let's do the mounting one, because that probably would make more sense in real life. We would want to maybe fetch something from an API, or we would want to set up an intersection observer, or a window add event listener, or something like that, or an interval, or a timeout, or whatever it happens to be, right? We could do that in here, knowing that it's only going to happen that one time, the first time that the component actually mounts up. All right. Now, this is called a side effect because these are things that happen outside of React. If you think about it, here we're interacting with a console. If we were fetching something, we're interacting within a third-party API. If we're doing like intersection observer or timeout, we're interacting with the DOM directly, and React doesn't know about that stuff, right? It only knows about the stuff outside of here. That's why these are called useEffects, unlike a useState, which React does track for us. Okay, so useEffect is purely used to run effects, and a lot of time you won't need them. But when you do need them, it's important to actually know how they work when it comes in the context of these actual life cycles. Okay, cool. So let's keep going with our slides. The next most important thing that we need to know, and this is probably the thing that actually took me quite a while to understand, and it's not covered as often as I'd like to be. So I hope that this is useful. I want to show you the cleanup functions for the useEffect hook, and I'm going to explain why that this is really important. And if we skip it, we're going to run into a lot of kind of funny bugs and a lot of issues in our applications. It turns out that you can actually return a function from useEffect. Okay. The function that we return is going to be run as a cleanup function, which means that when for example, if we take the context of mounting a component in this case, you can see that I have an empty dependency array. This is telling React, hey, when you unmount the component, so the next time that this useEffect runs, I want you to clean up after yourself and run this function. Now that might seem a little bit weird because like, what does cleanup even mean? Like, why do we need to clean up after ourselves, right? It turns out in React, just like in real life, it's very important to clean up after yourself. Otherwise you can make a big mess. So in this case, what cleanup means in the specific context of a mounting of a component is running something when we unmount the component. Okay, so when our dependency array is empty and we pass that in, React is going to take that function and execute it and actually run it when the component unmounts. Okay, and this is only in the case of an empty dependency array. This behavior changes depending on which style of useEffect we're running, but the concept is the same. It's going to run it when the next kind of time this hook comes to run is cleaning up after the first run, if that makes sense. That's probably a bad explanation, so let me actually show you a demo just so that we can actually see how this works. So I'll skip these for now. In fact, what I'll do is I'll actually just comment all of these out so we can actually just focus on the mounting one for now. So what I'll do in this mounting one is I'm going to return a function. This has to be a function because React is going to take that function as a callback or a handle, and it's going to execute it later on when this actually ends up happening. And what is the thing that ends up happening in this case is going to be the unmount, which is it's removed from the DOM. So I'm going to say console.log and I'm going to say unmounted. Okay. So what this is telling React is, hey, run this code here, line 20 in this case, when the component first mounts on the DOM. And then also, please, when the component is unmounted from the DOM and this component cleans up after itself, please execute this function right here, which is going to console log unmounted. And I'll show you this and I'll explain why this is useful in a second. So I'll switch back to Chrome. I'll reload the page here. And notice something curious. We're actually getting mounted, unmounted, and then mounted again. Now, this comes back to kind of what I've been saying this whole time, which is that in dev mode, React is actually going to run our effects twice. Okay, and it does this specifically because of exactly the cleanup function. It wants to make sure that we are correctly cleaning up after ourselves and we're not making a mess. And this is how it helps us detect bugs. This is not the behavior in production mode. Once we actually deploy this app, it is only going to run kind of one time, right? Which makes sense. So what we're seeing is React is going to mount the component in dev mode in this case. It's going to unmount the component and then it's going to remount the component. Oops, I got too excited there. And it's going to remount the component. All right. And again, this is only in dev mode. In reality, once we put this in production and we build this application, we would only see an unmount when it actually unmounts from the DOM, which is, like I said before, if we hide and show the component, for example, or if we move to different pages, then it's get mounted and then unmounted. Okay. So luckily for us, we do get to see this correctly, because otherwise I would have to probably do a hide and show a demo to actually show this correctly, but hopefully you can see how that actually works. Great. So I'll comment this one out for now. And I'll comment this one in next, which is re-render. And I'll return a function here. And I'll say return a function. And I'll just say console.log re-rendered cleanup. Okay, there we go. So I'll come back to Chrome here and I'll refresh the page. And we see, just like we saw with the mount, where we get re-rendered, we get the cleanup function run, and then we get it re-rendered again. So this is React testing that our effects properly clean up after ourselves in dev mode. Now notice something interesting. If I click go up for C1, we're going to see, or go up for C2 in this case, we're going to see that it is constantly re-rendering and cleaning up after itself, right? So if I see these two, what I'm going to see first when I click go up C1 is it's going to clean up the previous effect and it's going to run the new effect. So this cleanup is cleaning up the previous use effect from the previous render. And then this re-render is coming from the new effect from the new re-render. So every single time the component runs, these effects are running as a new function. So we need to, if we're doing anything that might cause like a memory leak, or some kind of like too many observers being set up or intervals and things like that, we want to make sure that we clean up after those or clear the intervals, for example, or unsubscribe from observers, and various other things like that to make sure that we're actually cleaning up. If you've seen work, for example, on the back end where you're working with like files, for example, you've probably seen something similar, where you usually go through something like opening a file, then you can read from the file, then you kind of clean up after yourself by actually closing the file so that other programs can actually then open the file, because only one program should be able to have access to that file at a time. Otherwise, you can run into a lot of issues, right? So very similar thing here. The most important thing, I'm going to refresh this again just so we can see, and I'll clear this just so we can see the update effect. When I click go up C1, we're cleaning up the previous effect. So what that means is we are running this function first from the previous render of our component. Then we're running this effect for the new version of that component. And then we're storing this to be run for the cleanup. Okay. So if I click go up C1, we're going to get re-rendered cleanup. And that's from the previous render cleanup function for that use effect. And the same thing is going to happen for C2 in this case, because this is all coming from one use effect here. Okay, so just to show you exactly how this works, just so it really hopefully hammers this in, I'm going to comment these both back in here, and I'm going to return a function, and this is going to console.log, and I'll just say here cleanup counter 1. And I'll show you an example concretely of why this is really important and how it can cause a lot of bugs if we don't be careful with how we actually do this. Console log, this is cleanup counter 2. All right, so now I have everything else commented out, and I'm just logging the use effects for when counter 1 changes or counter 2 changes, as well as their actual cleanup functions, and we can see them differentiated by counter 1 and counter 2. Okay, so I'll save that, reload the page, and we see that those all run. We're mounting, cleaning up, and then remounting the component the first time. So what's interesting though is I'll clear that. I'll click go up C1, and we'll see that we're only cleaning up after counter C1, which means we're running this first from the previous effect, and then we're creating the new effect where we're actually running hide there counter 1, which is what we see right here. So if I click it again, what we'll see is it's going to execute this first from the previous effect, and we're going to see hide there C1 again, and that's exactly what we see. Okay, and the same thing is true for C2. What we'll see is a cleanup run first for C2, and then we're actually going to see the console log for C2, right? And those are separate from each other because we've separated counter 1 from counter 2. Great. So the visual for that one, I created all of these ones, right? So hopefully it kind of makes a little bit of sense when these are running. In the case of no dependency array, this is going to run every single re-render no matter what, which is that second example that we saw, as well as on the unmount, because that technically counts as an update. And then the same thing for the passing the actual state values in here. And we can pass in multiple if we want to listen to multiple at once, or we can pass them in separately if we want to do different things for different types of states. And this is going to run that every single time that state actually changes. Okay. Now, why is this important? Okay. What does this clean up? Let me give you a concrete example of how this is going to terribly break if we don't have a proper cleanup. So I'm going to comment all this out and create a new useEffect just to prove how this works. So I'm going to create a useEffect. And in this useEffect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate a random number just so that we can see kind of how we had like, this 1 and 2, so we can see things very clearly. I'm just going to generate random numbers so we can for sure differentiate between kind of re-renders very easily. So I'll just say const random equals math.floor, math.random, and I'll just do it between like 0 and like 1,000, for example. That should be good enough. Okay, and then I'll just say console.log, and I'll just say actually I'll do console.log in a second. What I'll do is in this useEffect, I'm going to show you an actual side effect. Okay, I mean, technically we've been seeing side effects so far with our console logs because that's interacting with an external system, which is the console DevTools. But I'm going to show you like a more practical example that we might actually see on top of just console log. I'll do a setInterval. Okay, setInterval allows us to run a function, and it allows us to give a time for that function to run, and I'll say 1,000 milliseconds. Okay, so this is going to schedule this function to run every 1 second. All right, cool. So what I'll do here, inside of this function, I'm going to say console.log, and I'll do a template string here, and I'll say let me do this. I'll say like that, re-rendered. And in here, I'll put my random number. Okay. So what we'll see is that we'll generate a random number, and we're going to set up an interval, and we're going to run that every 1 second. And it's gonna show us quite discreetly what that number was. And if we ever have more than one of these, it'll be pretty obvious because we should see, hopefully, unless we generate the same random number 2 times, that it's going to be like a different render. Okay, so everything else is the same in this component. Okay, I haven't changed anything. I just commented all the other effects out and just have this effect in here. So I save that file. I'm going to switch back here, and I'm going to reload the page. All right, so what we're seeing is kind of 2 of these numbers being generated. And this is because our component is creating, or React in dev mode is actually kind of testing for exactly this, right? And you can see it's just ongoing every single second. Now, there's a lot of issues with this, and I'll show you in a second what the issues are. But what React is doing in dev mode only is it's mounting, unmounting, and then remounting the component. So what that means is it's going to execute this code 1 time, which means it's going to generate a random number, set the interval for 1 second, and then use that random number to console log. It's going to unmount. We don't have a cleanup function, so it's going to do nothing. Then it's going to remount it, which means it's going to generate another random number, set up another second interval every 1 second with that different random number. And that's what we're seeing right here. We're seeing 2 random numbers, in this case 358 and 133, being used for that. So there's something kind of weird here. We probably intended this to only happen once, but it's happening twice. Okay, can we fix this? What if I say only run this on mount, like this? Only run it on mount, and I'll save that, and I'll refresh the page. And we'll see that, no, that doesn't actually fix it. We still get it twice for the exact reason that I said, because React Dev Mode is testing for this to make sure we don't run into bugs exactly like this. So there's something wrong here. I'm going to switch this back to every single re-render, and I'll refresh the page. So you can see that the numbers are changing, so we at least know that that's working. I want to show you something really kind of brutal for a second. Notice that we have 2 intervals running here. And one is 305 and one is 941 in this particular case. Okay, I'll zoom in a little bit more here just so you can really see that. All right, now I'm going to click go up C1. I want you to think for a second. What is going to happen? This is a really challenging question. In fact, I wish I could ask this like in an interview or something. I don't actually think many people will get this unless you're quite seasoned with React. Again, probably not a great interview question because it's very, very React specific. But if it's like you're very, very advanced in React, this is something you definitely would want to know. What happens if I click on go up C1, which we know is going to change this counter? What does that mean? It's going to re-render our application or this component, in our application, our app component, which means that this useEffect is going to run again because it has no dependency array, which means that it's going to generate another random number and another interval. So we're going to see a third interval just from clicking go up C1. So right now, notice we have two intervals, 941 and 305. I'm going to click go up C1. And there you go. Now you see that we have another one. Right? We have 940, oh my gosh, it's scrolling by so fast. 941, 738, and 305. Okay, and click go up C2. Let's see what happens. Now we have another one, right? So we have four, just to really clear this up, I'm going to clear the console. We have four of these running at the same time, right? We have 305, 941, 737, and oh my gosh, this is really hard to read. You can probably see it. To make this really brutal, I'm just gonna click this a bunch of times and click this a bunch of times. And now what you'll see is boom, 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 right? Like that's just crazy, right? We have all of these intervals being set up and they're just constantly being scheduled. Interval. We probably have like 10 of them set up right now, right? This is just going to continue indefinitely until like we just kind of probably clear the intervals or delete this component or something, right? So this is not good. This is exactly what people talk about when they talk about things like memory leaks. This is a pretty trivial example because an interval is not too bad. We're only console logging in this case. It's kind of some memory intensive stuff going on. But imagine if this was like reaching out to like a fetch request for an API, or if it was like reading and writing from the file system or some other things, right? If you started doing this too many times, you would end up with just like a catastrophe after a certain amount of time of the application being opened, okay? So we need to fix this. So how do we fix this? Well, we need to clear this interval every single time it gets set up, if that's what we want to do. Right? So for example, let's do this. Let's set it up on mount. I'm going to set it to be on mount and I'll refresh this page. And what we'll see is we get these two, 649 or 646 and 931. I click these buttons. Luckily, nothing happened because we're not re-rendering that effect because it's only happening on mount. So that's kind of solves a little bit of the problem, but not really all of it. Because what if we wanted to run on every single re-render? So let's solve it for this case first. Actually, the same case for both of them. We want to clear this interval every single time this effect runs, and then we can set up a new interval the next time, right? Maybe that's not what you want, but most of the time, that's probably going to be what you want, right? So I'm going to say const ID is equal to that. So setInterval gives us back the ID for the interval. And I'm going to return a function that's going to run clear interval, and we have to pass it the ID. Okay, I'll split this up. So this is the cleanup. So what React is going to do is it's going to generate a random number, it's going to set the interval, and then when that component, in this case, unmounts, it's going to clear that interval. So now, the first time that we run this component, what we should see is only one random number being generated with only one interval. So that should fix our first problem. Let me refresh this page. And what we'll see is indeed now we have exactly what we expect. We have only one random number being generated with one interval being set, which is why this is now just counting up like this. And if I click on these, it has no effect because we are only running this on mount. Now, let's see what happens if I remove this dependency array, which means I want to run this on every single re-render. I want you to think, what is going to happen? Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to switch back here and I'm going to refresh the page. Now, the first render is what we expect, which is the mount. So that's great. So we have a new random number and we're re-rendering. So that's fine. So that's working. So we're not getting the duplicate kind of issue that we had before. I'm going to click go up C1. So I'm going to generate a new state, which is going to rerun this app, which is going to rerun this effect since it has no dependency. And what we expect to see is the previous interval being cleared and a new interval being set up. Okay, so let me switch back here. I'll click go up C1. And what we see is indeed that behavior. We see a new interval being set up and the previous interval being cleared, which is the one that was set up during the mounting of this component. Okay, I'll click go up C2. And now that's the exact same behavior. It's going to clear the interval that was there before, and we're only going to have one interval running for this component at any given time. Okay, I'll click this many, many times. And we indeed get a new interval. So we cleared up a bunch of them and we scheduled the very last one here, which is that new number. So this is happening because we only have this one useEffect and it's only scheduling one set interval, and that's always being cleaned up every single time this runs if it's being run multiple times, which is exactly what's happening in this case. Okay, so we're cleaning up the previous interval and scheduling a new one. Now, you can imagine this also applies to specifically listen to counter or counter to or any other state, and we can have multiple effects and each of them can clean itself up in various ways. And hopefully you can now see why that's important. If you're doing some kind of thing like this, right? Like setting up some kind of thing that's always going to be there behind the scenes, or a fetch request or whatever it happens to be, you want to be very careful that you are indeed cleaning up after yourself in that effect, because if you don't, it can lead to memory leaks, many other types of bugs, overloads of maybe your server, a whole bunch of crazy issues and bugs will pop up and slow down your application, and you'll have to bug hunt for that one. So if you're doing things like this, make sure that you're cleaning up after yourself inside the useEffect. But if it's something simple, just like a console log, for example, then you probably don't need to clean up after yourself in that particular case or similar cases to that. All right. Now, to wrap up this video, I know we went long, but hopefully we covered a lot of ground there, and that helps a lot. I want you to think of everything as a tree again in React. Right? So I think I said the word re-rendering and mounting and unmounting like 100 times in this video. It's crucial to understand that everything is a DOM tree at the end of the day, right? React has a DOM tree that it manages as well as the actual DOM itself. And what that means and why that's important for us is that when I say re-render and mount and unmount, that's always in the context of this tree, right? If something changes inside of app, for example, and app has a component inside of it, for example, contact form or navbar, right? Those are going to re-render, right? Which means that their useEffects are going to run. And this carries down through the entire tree, right? You can imagine how disastrous this would get if imagine our component didn't have a cleanup function in it and it was really, really far down this tree and it was being constantly re-rendered from higher up in the tree. That would cause an unimaginable amount of intervals or whatever type of side effects we're having in there, and it would be a total disaster very quickly. So re-renders are caused not only from the component itself, but also from the parent actually re-rendering as well. Because in the context of the parent re-rendering, the child has to re-render to figure itself back out because that's what the parent needs to figure itself out. Okay, and and kind of up the tree it goes. So always keep that in mind as well. And I want to show you one last thing as well. And I had this in the previous video, but it's so important to keep in mind just as a mental picture is this is really kind of what's happening behind the scenes to some degree. We have our effects and we have our components, and these effects are not running synchronously. Just like useState, they are being run asynchronously and they're being kept track of by React itself. Right? So in this case, for example, this hello component, React literally in memory somewhere has a space where it's keeping track of these useEffects. You can see I just labeled these as 1 and 2. That doesn't really mean anything special, just so that 2 separate effects. And React is going to run them in order, kind of top to bottom, depending on what their dependency arrays are, every single time that component re-renders. Okay, so keep that in mind. These are all asynchronous, and it's important to keep any code you have that is a side effect inside of there and not in the actual body here of the function, because these are scheduled in a pretty efficient way by React, so that they don't actually like block the rendering of your application, for example. All right, so that was quite a doozy. That was a lot. This particular hook is definitely quite complex. There's a lot of things to keep track of. In fact, you're probably looking at this and being like, oh my goodness, none of that made any sense, right? Or like I only got like 25% of that or something. And if you do, that's fine, right? It just takes a lot of practice. You have to just keep using this stuff. The main thing is to realize that these things are there and be aware of them. And then you can slowly start leveraging them and using them and testing that they make sure that they work, so you can solidify your understanding. So that said, what I'm going to do in the next video is create some exercises for the useEffect hook so that we can really get an understanding of how this works and put some tricks in there, hopefully, so we can see some concrete examples beyond the ones that we saw in this video together, and really kind of go through those and get some more practice before we start looking at the next hooks after useEffect. But these useState and useEffect really are kind of the core hooks that we need to build a lot of different applications, and the other ones just help us with many different types of things using the React style. So I hope you found this video valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel, as well as set up a Patreon, as well as YouTube memberships and super thanks. So if you want to show your support, those are other ways to show your support as well. So until we see each other in the exercise videos, I will see you later. Bye-bye.